My name is Audrey Croft, and I believe that sometimes the quietest decisions create the most profound changes. I grew up in a small town nestled in the foothills of the Appalachians, a place where the air always smelled of damp earth and pine, and where your family name meant more than your bank account. I was the first in my family to go to college, the first to move to a city like Riverbend, a sprawling, gentle metropolis carved by the wide, slow-moving Calliope River. My life was built on a foundation of quiet determination, a promise I'd made to my parents and to myself that I would build something lasting, something honorable. For 3 years, that something was my career at Oakhaven Partners. I was not a star in the flashy, bombastic sense. I was more like a deep-root system, the unseen force that gave the beautiful tree its stability. My work was in strategic development, and I had a gift for seeing the connections others missed, for weaving disparate threads of data and human need into a coherent, elegant tapestry. I loved the puzzle of it, the quiet satisfaction of bringing a complex project to life. My mentor, Beatrice, was the one who first saw that potential in me. She was a woman who moved with a gentle authority, her silver hair always in a neat chignon, her voice a calm and steadying presence in the often chaotic world of corporate strategy. "Audrey," she would say, her eyes crinkling at the corners, "you have a rare kind of sight. You don't just look at a problem, you see through it. Never let anyone convince you that quiet is the same as weak." Beatrice was grooming me, teaching me the delicate art of client diplomacy, the ethics of leadership, the responsibility that came with shaping a company's future. I was her succession plan, and the knowledge was a warm, steady glow inside me. Then, one Tuesday morning in early spring, Beatrice called me into her office. The room, usually filled with the scent of her favorite Earl Grey tea, felt still and heavy. Her husband, she explained, had received a difficult diagnosis, and they were moving to the coast to be closer to a specialized medical center. She was retiring, effective immediately. The news left a hollow space in the center of my chest. It wasn't just the loss of my mentor, it was the sudden, jarring disappearance of the path I thought was laid out before me. Her departure came at the worst possible moment. We were on the cusp of securing the Greenwood Initiative, a landmark project focused on sustainable urban development that I had poured my heart into for over a year. It was more than a contract, it was a chance to reshape a part of our city, to build something with meaning. Every projection, every community outreach plan, every word of the proposal was mine. It was to be my masterpiece, the culmination of everything Beatrice had taught me. That's when Damian Pierce arrived. He came from our satellite office in the capital, a man stitched together from sharp suits and a blindingly charismatic smile. He had a way of leaning in when he spoke to you, making you feel as though you were the only person in a crowded room. His reputation was one of solid competence, though not remarkable innovation. When the announcement came that he would be stepping into Beatrice's role as director, I felt a pang of disappointment, but I tamped it down. I resolved to be a partner to him, to help him succeed, assuming that a rising tide would lift all boats, including my own. The first tremor of unease came during his introductory address to the team. He stood at the front of the conference room, the light from the large windows glinting off his perfect hair, and presented the Greenwood Initiative strategy. My strategy. He spoke my words, presented my research, and laid out my vision with a polished, confident air. He presented it all as his own. Not once did my name cross his lips. Not a single nod of acknowledgement, not a hint of collaborative credit. I sat there, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, my blood turning to ice. I watched him receive the team's impressed applause for my late nights, for the conversations I'd had with community leaders, for the breakthrough I'd had at 3 a.m. staring at a city map. I told myself he was nervous. I told myself he'd forgotten in the moment. I told myself he would thank me privately. He never did. That day marked the beginning of a slow, creeping erosion. Over the next year, a quiet, insidious pattern emerged. I would bring a fully formed concept to our one-on-one meetings, a new client retention model, a market analysis, an efficiency proposal. I'd walk him through the logic, the data, the projected outcomes. Days later, I would hear my own phrases echoing from his mouth in executive meetings. My insights, repackaged and presented as his spontaneous brilliance. When I tried to gently assert my contribution, he had a masterful way of deflecting. "That's a good starting point, Audrey," he'd say, interrupting me. "What I think you're trying to get at is this," and he would then articulate my own point back to me, framing it as his clarification of my muddled thoughts. He was a master of psychological theft, leaving no fingerprints. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just the plagiarism, it was the way he paired it with public criticism. After successfully implementing a cost-saving measure I had designed, he remarked in a team meeting, "Audrey needs to develop a stronger grasp of the financial big picture." He would use the presentation skills I had coached him on, then note in my performance review that my own communication style lacked executive presence. I felt like I was losing my footing, like the solid ground of my own competence was turning to sand beneath my feet. Was I being overly sensitive? Was this just the rough and tumble of the corporate world that Beatrice had tried to prepare me for? I began to document everything: emails with time-stamped ideas, meeting notes, project drafts. I created a meticulous, secret file, a testament to my own work, if only for my own sanity. But I knew it was useless as proof. Damien was too clever for that. His theft was verbal, his instructions subtle, his praise-stealing performed in rooms where I was either absent or silenced. My colleagues, people I had considered friends, grew distant. They saw my confidence waning and mistook it for incompetence. They saw Damien's star rising and assumed he was the visionary he claimed to be. I was becoming isolated, a ghost in the machine I had helped to build. The vibrant, determined woman who had arrived in Riverbend was fading, replaced by a quiet, anxious shadow of herself. The turning point came not in a flash of anger, but in a moment of quiet, heartbreaking clarity. I was sitting at my desk late one evening, staring out at the Calliope River as it reflected the glittering city lights. I had just spent a week crafting a truly innovative proposal for a new client, a project I was genuinely excited about. And I knew, with a certainty that ached in my bones, that if I gave it to Damien, he would claim it and some part of me would break for good. In that moment, I understood. Damien wasn't a brilliant strategist who happened to be a thief. He was an empty vessel. His success was entirely, completely parasitic. Without my ideas, he had nothing. And in that quiet, riverside office, I decided to stop feeding him. It was an experiment born of desperation and a flicker of returning self-worth. I didn't stop working. I simply stopped giving him my best. My proposals became competent but uninspired. My contributions in meetings were safe, conventional. I offered the kind of bland, textbook solutions that anyone in my position could have generated. I stopped pouring my soul onto the page. I walled off the garden of my creativity and offered him only the most common, unremarkable stones from the path. The effect was immediate and, for him, catastrophic. His next major client pitch was a disaster. Without my unique insights to animate his charisma, his presentation was nothing more than a collection of hollow corporate buzzwords. The client, a progressive tech firm, noted the lack of original thinking in their rejection letter. Team morale began to plummet under his increasingly erratic and empty leadership. He grew desperate, his charm fraying at the edges, replaced by a palpable anxiety. He was a magician whose secret source of rabbits had vanished. While my visible performance was declining, I was secretly, carefully, building something new. I had always been intimidated by our CEO, Mr. Sterling Hayes. He was a remote figure, a name on a letterhead, a presence felt but rarely seen. He was known for his sharp intellect and his intolerance for sycophants. But Beatrice had once told me that he had a deep, abiding respect for genuine, well-researched ideas, no matter their source. Holding on to that sliver of hope, I requested a 15-minute meeting with him. Not to complain, not to expose Damien, but under the guise of discussing a small operational efficiency I had noticed. I was terrified. But the thought of remaining a victim was even more frightening. I walked into his top-floor office, a space of minimalist elegance with a breathtaking view of the river and the mountains beyond. I presented my idea, a minor but clever tweak to our internal reporting system. It was a small, safe offering. He listened intently, his bird-like eyes sharp and focused. He asked 2 insightful questions, nodded, and thanked me for my time. A week later, I requested another meeting, this time with a slightly bigger idea. Then another. I never mentioned Damien. I never hinted at my struggles. I simply used those brief, focused meetings to show him my mind at work. I presented the kind of thinking I had been hiding from Damien, the real, innovative, deeply researched strategies that were my signature. I was, piece by piece, reintroducing him to the work of the woman Beatrice had mentored. Mr. Hayes began extending our meetings. He started asking my opinion on broader strategic questions. "That's a fascinating perspective, Ms. Croft," he'd murmur, steepling his fingers. "You see the ecosystem, not just the single tree." A quiet rapport began to build between us, a professional respect that felt like a lifeline. Then, about a month ago, he said the words that changed everything. "Audrey," he said, "foregoing the formal MS, Croft, for the first time, I have been observing your work, both on paper and in person. I believe your talents are being underutilized. I'm convening a special session with the board of directors in 3 weeks. I want you to present your vision for the company's 5-year growth." The board presentation. It was the highest possible stage, a career-defining opportunity. My heart hammered against my ribs. And then he gave me the date and time, and a cold, beautiful certainty washed over me. The board meeting was scheduled for the exact same day, at the exact same time, as our quarterly team meeting, the very meeting where Damien, furious and floundering from my recent subpar performance, had been planning to make an example of me. And so, I found myself sitting in that glass-walled conference room, a sacrificial lamb waiting for the slaughter. 20 of my colleagues were arranged around the polished mahogany table, their expressions ranging from pity to indifference. Damien stood at the head of the table, pacing like a predator. He had a stack of my recent, deliberately mediocre reports in his hand. He began his speech, his voice dripping with faux disappointment. He spoke of accountability, of high standards, of the unfortunate reality that some people simply couldn't keep pace in a demanding environment. He didn't use my name, not at first, but every eye in the room was on me. Some people, he continued, his voice rising, refuse to take ownership of their declining performance. They look for others to blame. They lack the fundamental integrity to admit when they are out of their depth. Each word was a carefully aimed stone. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. I focused on my breathing, on the memory of Beatrice's calm voice, on the weight of the leather-bound portfolio that lay hidden in my lap. A few people were nodding along with Damien's assessment. A junior analyst I had mentored was pointedly staring at her phone. Then came the final, brutal blow. Damien slapped the reports down on the table, the sound cracking through the tense silence. He finally looked directly at me, his eyes cold and triumphant. "You, Audrey, are the biggest disappointment this division has ever seen." A nervous titter of laughter rippled through the room. It was a dreadful, humiliating sound. The laughter of people relieved the target wasn't them. It felt like 1,000 tiny cuts. In that moment, I felt a strange and profound stillness. I had reached the bottom. There was nowhere to go but up. Just as the laughter began to swell, the conference room door swung open. Mr. Sterling Hayes stepped inside. The room fell silent in an instant. The laughter died in people's throats. Mr. Hayes's presence commanded an absolute, immediate authority. His sharp eyes scanned the room, passing over Damien's shocked face, and settled on me. He offered me a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Audrey," he said, his clear, calm voice cutting through the thick atmosphere. "My apologies. I believe we're late for our board presentation." You could have heard a thought form in the silence that followed. 20 faces swiveled from me to Mr. Hayes and back again, their expressions a slow-motion cascade of confusion, dawning comprehension, and, finally, utter shock. Damien's face was a mask of disbelief, the triumphant sneer melting into a slack-jawed horror as the gears of his understanding finally, belatedly, turned. He was not the predator in this room. He was the prey. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate. I picked up the portfolio from my lap, its weight now feeling solid and grounding. As I walked to the front of the room, every eye followed me. The same colleagues who had been witnessing my public execution were now staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. Mr. Hayes took the seat at the head of the table, Damien's seat. "Shall we begin?" he asked the room at large, though his eyes were on me. What followed was not an act of revenge. It was an act of reclamation. For the next hour, I didn't just give a presentation, I unveiled a part of my soul. I walked the board and my stunned colleagues through the 5-year growth strategy one had been building in secret. It was the Greenwood Initiative, magnified tenfold, a vision for Oakhaven Partners that was innovative, deeply humane, and meticulously researched. It was built on the sustainable, ethical principles Beatrice had instilled in me. Every slide was clean and powerful. Every projection was backed by layers of data. Every idea was authentically mine, born from the creative wellspring I had so carefully protected. As I spoke, I found my voice no longer quiet and hesitant, but clear and resonant with a passion I hadn't allowed myself to feel in over a year. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched Damien. I saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes turn to dawning recognition, and then to a pale, sickening horror as he finally understood. He was watching the ghost he had tried to create rise up and effortlessly reclaim her life. This wasn't a meeting, it was my interview. It was my coronation. When I finished, the room didn't just applaud. They erupted. It was a wave of genuine, heartfelt enthusiasm. Board members were leaning forward, smiling, their questions sharp and engaged. I answered each one with a calm, unshakable confidence, because this was my work. I knew its every strength, its every vulnerability. Mr. Hayes stood and walked to my side. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that was both a commendation and a shield. "This," he announced to the room, his voice ringing with authority, "is the kind of visionary leadership this company needs. Audrey, I am proud to announce your promotion to Director of Strategic Development, effective immediately." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, Mr. Hayes turned his gaze to the man who was still frozen in his chair. "Damien," he said, his voice now devoid of all warmth, "I will see you in my office to discuss the details of your transition." The word transition hung in the air, a corporate euphemism for an execution. As the meeting broke up, a few colleagues approached me, their faces a mixture of awe and shame. "Audrey, I had no idea," one mumbled. "That was brilliant." They were apologies offered too late, but I accepted them with a simple, quiet nod. My final act in that room was for myself. I walked over to Damien, who sat staring at the polished table as if his entire world had been reflected back at him, shattered into a million pieces. I leaned in, my voice low, for his ears only. "Thank you, Damien." He looked up, his eyes wide with confusion. "Thank you," I repeated softly. "You taught me the most valuable lesson of my career. By trying so hard to take my work, you forced me to understand its true worth. You showed me that my ideas have power. And you taught me that I should never, ever give that power away for free again." I straightened up and walked out of the conference room, leaving him alone with the ruins of the career he had built on a foundation of lies. I didn't feel vengeful or triumphant. I felt a profound sense of peace. It was the quiet, clean feeling of a house that has finally been put back in order. I hadn't destroyed Damien. I had simply stopped holding him up, and he had collapsed under his own weight. The story, I thought, was over. But the roots of the problem at Oakhaven ran deeper than one man's insecurity. My real work was just beginning. In the weeks that followed my promotion, I settled into my new role with a sense of purpose that felt both exhilarating and deeply calming. I inherited Beatrice's old office, the one with the lovely view of the river. I brought in my own plants, lined the shelves with books on urban planning and ethical economics, and made a point of brewing a pot of Earl Grey tea every morning, a small tribute to the woman who had set me on this path. But a question lingered in the back of my mind. How could a man like Damien operate for so long unchecked? One afternoon, I was having coffee with Layla, a whip-smart analyst from the HR department who had always been kind to me, even during my darkest days. She had been one of the few who hadn't laughed in the final meeting, her expression one of deep discomfort. "I'm so glad Mr. Hayes finally saw what was happening," she said, stirring her latte. "A few of us knew. We saw the pattern." "What pattern?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. Layla hesitated, glancing around the busy cafe. It's just, you weren't the first, Audrey. There were others. Good people. Leo in finance, Sophie from client relations. They both worked under Damien. They were brilliant, and then, suddenly, their performance reviews tanked and they left. Leo took a lower-paying job at a rival firm. Sophie moved back home. It never made sense. She then said something that made my blood run cold. They both filed formal complaints with Gregory Kent before they left. I saw the paperwork. But nothing ever came of it. Gregory Kent, the head of human resources. A man with a placid, almost bored demeanor who always spoke about company policy as if it were an unfortunate but necessary burden. He and Damien were often seen at lunch together, a detail I'd never thought much of before. That conversation was the key. This wasn't just a case of one toxic manager. It was a systemic failure, a quiet conspiracy of mediocrity protecting itself. The need for revenge had long since faded from my heart, replaced by a much stronger emotion, responsibility. I had been given a position of power, and I could use it to simply enjoy my own success, or I could use it to heal the wounds I now knew existed within the company. I owed it to Beatrice, to Leo and Sophie, and to the Audrey who had almost been broken. I didn't want a war. I wanted to bring the truth into the light, gently but firmly. I spent the next 2 weeks conducting what I called a cultural health audit. With Mr. Hayes's blessing, I reached out to a handful of other former employees who had left under similar circumstances. I didn't frame it as an investigation. I framed it as a listening tour. I wanted to understand their experiences, to learn what Oakhaven could do better. Their stories were variations on a single, heartbreaking theme. They spoke of ideas being dismissed in meetings only to reappear as Damien's own. They spoke of Gregory Kent's placating, dismissive responses to their concerns, chalking them up to personality conflicts or adjustment issues. They had all been made to feel like the problem. Armed with these stories, not as accusations, but as data points of a cultural sickness, I scheduled a meeting with Mr. Hayes. I laid out the pattern, the quiet exodus of talent, the financial and creative cost to the company, and the common denominators, Damien Pierce and Gregory Kent. Mr. Hayes listened without interruption, his expression growing more grave with each story I relayed. He had seen the symptoms, the puzzling employee turnover, the stalled projects, but he hadn't understood the disease. They created a system, he said, his voice a low rumble of anger, that punished innovation and protected theft. They mistook stability for health, when in fact it was stagnation. He launched a discreet, formal internal investigation, led by an outside counsel. It was no longer my personal battle, it was a corporate imperative. The investigation uncovered a damning trail of emails between Damien and Gregory, a casual, arrogant correspondence that detailed their strategy of managing out employees they deemed too ambitious or too clever, all while harvesting their best ideas. They had been friends since business school, a two-man club dedicated to propping each other up. The fallout was quiet, but absolute. Gregory Kent was terminated for gross misconduct and a breach of his fiduciary duty to the company's employees. The legal team initiated proceedings against Damien to claw back bonuses he had received based on the fraudulent presentation of others' work. His professional reputation, the only real currency he had ever possessed, was left in tatters. My final act in the matter was personal. I wrote letters to Leo, Sophie, and the other former employees I had spoken to. I told them what had happened, and on behalf of Oakhaven Partners, I offered them a sincere, unequivocal apology. I told them that they had been right, that they had been wronged, and that the company was now committed to building a culture where their experiences would not be repeated. Sophie wrote back. She told me my letter had lifted a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying. She wasn't ready to return to Riverbend, but she was, for the first time in years, thinking about her next creative project with excitement instead of fear. That, to me, was the truest victory. 6 months have passed. My days are filled with the good, hard work of building. My team is a vibrant collection of brilliant minds, and we make a point to celebrate every contribution, big or small. My first major initiative as director was to create a new, robust mentorship program, modeled on the guidance and care Beatrice had shown me. We named it the Beatrice Initiative in her honor. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, I stand at my window and look out at the Calliope River. I watch the water flow steadily toward the sea, and I think about the nature of strength. I once thought it was about being unshakable, about never showing weakness. Now I know that's not true. True strength is found in the quiet resolve to stand up after you've been knocked down. It's in the courage to protect your own light when someone is trying to extinguish it. It's in learning to build boundaries not of stone, but of self-respect. I never heard what became of Damian Pierce. I hope, for his sake, that he one day learns to build something of his own. But his story is no longer a part of mine. My story is about the view from this window, the hum of creative energy from the room next door, and the quiet, steady satisfaction of doing good work in a place that is, finally, safe for it to grow. It's a story of reclamation, not of revenge, and it's a story that is still being written one quiet, determined day at a time.